Good evening, everyone.
Jeffrey.
And welcome to this evening's Ideas of Our Time lecture. That we have in connection with our John Cage exhibit upstairs called Don't Blame It on Them, John Cage and Friends, curated by Jade Bellinger. Hello, Jade, if you're out there. And organized in collaboration with Clark Lunberry College. So we have a surprise for you. Before we get Clark Lunberry up here to tell us a little bit about John Cage, the sessions or music students rather, from UNF are going to play us a short John Cage piece. So please give a warm welcome to our students. Come on down here and take your places.
You get to buy tea afterwards. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. We're members of the UNF Percussion Ensemble. Today we'll be playing a piece titled Earth Construction by John Cage. It was published and first performed in 1941 as part of John Cage's West Coast Tour. And it's just a fun, energetic piece, drums and cans and, jawbones, and a bunch of crazy instruments that John Cage really kind of brought to use in Western America. So I'm Jacob Parra. This is Devin Bruner, Devin Pita, and Ezra Wellborn. So we hope you guys enjoy it.
Bravo. Well, if that didn't set the stage for us, what would? Clark. So before inviting Clark up here to the stage, I want to say a few words and to introduce him. Clark is a professor at the University of North Florida in the Department of English. And his multidisciplinary approach, both in his scholarship and in his teaching, we have benefited from it greatly here at MoCA. The experiments between the arts of art and poetry is complemented with his own art practice, site-specific art and poetry installations that he calls writing on water, writing on air. And those that are here in person, we have some catalogs for you with those installations that Clark will tell us more about, I'm sure. Clark is here this evening to speak about John Cage, who, like Clark, understood the creative art act in an all-encompassing manner, whether expressed with words or sounds or painting. Apart from having published several essays on John Cage, Clark organized the John Cage Festival here in Jacksonville that took place at UNF in March of 2012. That celebrated Cage's, or would have been Cage's 100th birthday. But without further ado, please welcome Ms. Clark and
Thank you. Thank you, Ilva. And fantastic way to open. I really enjoyed that. First, though. Uh-oh. Uh-oh, Matthew? What do I need to do, Matthew? I thought just double clicking this.
It's right there in the center of the slide.
It is? What's in the center of the slide? Oh. Oh, la, 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 la. I'm not seeing it. Sorry. It's, oh, it's on, is on here, but it's not on here. I'm gonna need some help, Matthew. Sorry. Thought we'd rehearsed, but. I don't see a cursor on my screen.
Right, where's it gone? There it is. Let's try this again. There we go.
Okay, there we go.
I got it.
All right. All right. That piece is John Cage's 433 from 1952. The piece that we just heard, quite different, 1941. I'm going to be speaking about 433 a bit and a number of other things. Let me see, I've got to get back into PowerPoint here, and then I won't have to stray from it again. There we go. Here's the original cover for the covering of the score for 433, again, 1952. This is the way the score looked. It was in three sections to be played by any instrument, I believe it says there. And I'll get to this in a moment. Well, when asked a while back to speak about tonight about John Cage, and thank you for inviting me, I appreciate that, I began thinking about my early encounters with the man, how I came upon him, and just how important he's actually been for me for decades. I can think of few others, frankly, more influential and formative. In the early 1980s, I was an art history student at the University of Kansas, thrilled by all things modern and contemporary in the arts, still am, more or less. Likely, Cage's name must have kept coming up in what I was reading and looking at as a young student, perhaps in the context of the New York art world of the 1950s, or was it Dada and Duchamp? Cage was, after all, nonetheless, such a vital presence in New York at that remarkable period, seeming to be everywhere at every moment, working with everyone, painters, dancers, poets, musicians. And the photographs of Cage always showed such a joyous looking man, happily laughing at all the fun he was having. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. No doubt at that time, I must also have heard about Cage's silent piece, 433, his now legendary noteless composition for piano, in which at its 1952 premiere, the pianist David Tudor sat silently, never touching the piano's keys for the entire 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And like Duchamp's urinal fountain or his mustachioed Mona Lisa with her hot ass, I'm sure that I instantly loved Cage's piece without, of course, having heard it. The very idea of it, loving what Cage had done, its audacity, his audacity, the Dada daring of it all, risking the ridiculous, and an invitation to listen, to nothing at all. True, as I said, I hadn't yet heard the piece, whatever that might mean. I was still in Kansas after all, though in the case of this particular composition, it didn't seem like it much mattered. If I'd been there, heard that, heard what? As Cage once said of a concert hall, every seat is the best seat. But still, it sure did make me want to get out of Kansas and to go to New York. What a city it must be where such crazy and wonderful things could happen. By the way, I have since been present for and having heard Cage's 433 many times in many settings, as we just did, right, moments ago, though that was my first time at the center stage, so to speak, at the untouched piano. It's harder than it might look like, actually. And memorably, also in 2012, again, in this very auditorium, 433 was rendered voicelessly by my friend, the Dutch sound artist Jaap Blanc. His wide open mouth variously agape. And the amazing thing about this composition, 433, I kid you not, is that it works every time. Or it has for me, as I'm always delighted by what it offers, however small, however nearly nothing. I've been positioned each time to listen carefully to the sounds in the room, of the room, out of the room, those sounds around me, those sounds inside myself, and always detached that uncanny act of listening to my own listening. It's noteworthy, it seems to me, that Cage later claimed that of all of his many compositions, 433 was his most important. And that sounds about right to me, actually. One more endearing point about Cage's 433 is that he himself pointed out that his piece was inspired by his friend Robert Rauschenberg's 1951 white paintings. That's what we have on the screen. preceded by 1 year, the 1952 433. And Cage wrote, "To whom it may concern, Rauschenberg's white paintings came first. My silent piece came later." He wanted it to be clear. Going on to describe of Rauschenberg's painting how when he saw them, the light of the room fell unevenly upon their white surfaces, the shifting shadows cast upon the canvas. Even one's own shadow moved, Cage noted, as one moved alongside them. This acknowledgement of Rauschenberg must have been another factor in my affection for Cage. His eager and generous engagement with painters, the visual arts, his movement between disciplines of seeing with his ears and hearing with his eyes. Like so many others, at some early point, I must have heard about Cage's 1961 book, Silence. And it was probably in my university's library. By the way, if I had $1 for all the times I've heard now renowned artists, musicians, composers, poets, dancers say, "And then I found John Cage's Silence." Really, again and again, that book is pointed to. Upstairs, the book itself has turned into an artwork, right? Upstairs in the exhibition, this piece by David Muller. So the book itself has sort of been transformed as an object to be represented as an object of art itself. Well, that book had that kind of a massive impact upon me too when I was 19 or 20 or 21. Its collection of eccentric essays, its radical formatting, its typographic variety, its blank spaces, its interruptions and digressions, its various sections moving between the serious and the silly, the brilliant and the banal, sometimes the two seeming indistinguishable. And then within that book, its most well-known chapter titled Lecture on Nothing, where Cage begins by telling us that he has nothing to say and that he is saying it, and that is poetry. I love that. Expecting nothing, getting nothing, saying that nothing poetically with the very words on the page affirmed as a frame onto the silence. And then Cage continuing of that silence, that we need not fear these silences, he says, and that the words help make the silences, unquote. With the very pages of such statements filled with irregular spaces between the fragmented phrases, bits of emptiness there on the page, gaps that had to be navigated and I suppose silently heard. Or, to my undergraduate joy, very early into Cage's Lecture on Nothing, page 2 actually, as if out of nowhere and as if to offer some material shape to the silence while he was repeatedly speaking, Cage then writes, "Regard it," and you can see it up there somewhere, "regard it, the silence, as something seen momentarily as though from a window while traveling, if across Kansas. Then of course, Kansas. Now he knows he needs the Kansas in him. Kansas is like nothing on earth. It's like an empty glass, and Kansas has this about it. At any instant, one may leave it, and whenever one wishes, one may return to it, or you may leave it forever and never return to it, for we possess nothing. Our poetry now is the realization that we possess nothing." What a lovely and liberating thought, affirming the seeing of silences from the window of a moving car, and while driving through Kansas, my state. And even if Cage was speaking of Kansas metaphorically, I was living there quite literally. So with Cage's insight taken to heart, I immediately began listening differently to what my eyes could immediately see, seeing differently what my eyes could hear, as I continued on my many long drives across the wide open spaces of that state, a state that I thought I knew, but had in many ways in the thinking ceased to see. I'm sure that at the time, and however naively, I read that Kansas part of Cage's lecture with a certain thrill. It's hard to be from Kansas, I'll be honest. It's hard, for Kansas is otherwise so unseen, so flown over, so monochromatically not over rainbows, that I must have innocently felt that Cage was speaking directly to me, seeing me, inviting me to where I already was, and that Kansas, that nothing on earth part of his point, I likely construed not as a dig against the boring emptiness of Kansas, it's a familiar put down after all, but as a positive affirmation of a nothing of which I was already a part, as if inhabiting a kind of virtual Zen state, and as such, not to be blamed for it. For as Cage reminded and reassured, now he knows he needs the Kansas in him. But notably, as Cage also said of Kansas, at any moment one may leave it forever, which I shortly did, heading soon thereafter, you guessed it, to New York, where it seemed immediately that not nothing, but almost anything could happen at any moment, and it was all the time. Everywhere I looked and listened, I was clearly not in Kansas anymore, the nothing having given way to everything all at once. That sounds like a movie title suddenly. Once there, I often saw Cage moving about the town in the flesh from a distance at one event or another, until one day finally meeting at the end, at his end. But that's another story. By the way, I have long thought that Kansas should proudly adopt Cage's line as the state's motto: Kansas, like nothing on earth, placing it on billboards, seeing it as one enters the state, attributing it to John Cage. Good idea, right? It's a good idea. Yeah, I did that, Photoshop. It doesn't actually exist yet. The University of Kansas had, when I was a student there, in the basement of the psychology building, its own anechoic chamber. And as anyone familiar with Cage lore knows, such a chamber features prominently in Cage's writings and references. I'm not sure how I found out about KU's anechoic chamber. However, as soon as I heard about it, and in direct response to reading Cage, I sought permission to have a session inside it, eager to see what might be heard or not heard. That's Cage inside of an anechoic chamber. Cage offered two scenarios of his own early encounters with silence and of his subsequent exploration of its absence, one of which I've already mentioned, his silent composition, 433, which proved in the end hardly silent at all, but full of unexpected sounds. 433 was, though, preceded by a time spent inside an anechoic chamber at Harvard University. Such a space has been described as, quote, a room scientifically designed to absorb any and all sound waves, to diffuse any echoes or reverberations, making it as close to silent or dead, in the parlance of audio engineers, as possible, unquote. So once inside this chamber, Cage was reportedly startled, not by the anticipated silences encountered inside that space, but instead by the mysterious and unexpected continuation of two specific sounds, one high and one low, he reported, contained in this purportedly dead space. Cage wrote the following about what proved to be such an impactful experience. Yes, once again in his book, Silence, he writes about this. When I described these two sounds later, Cage wrote, to the engineer in charge, he informed me that the high one was my nervous system in operation, the low one, my blood in circulation. And Cage goes on to say, until I die, there will be sounds, and they will continue following my death, unquote. However, while still very much alive, Cage, very much alive inside the deadness of the anechoic chamber, Cage had realized that contrary to expectation and intention, he was seeking silence after all, there was, in fact, as he later stated, no such thing as silence. At least as long as the living body is there to listen for it. Heard instead inescapably are the constant polymorphous variations of life-confirming noises already filling the ear, or preceding even the ear's finest reception, hearing before and after the ear has even heard. Though this experience in the anechoic chamber came before Cage's eventual involvement with Zen Buddhism and his subsequent study with Daisetsu Suzuki at Columbia University in the 1950s, its discoveries nonetheless obliquely anticipated some of Zen's motivations and aims, meditative aims and methods, the sitting still, the body's deliberate breathing, the silencing of the self in order to facilitate a listening of listening, a thinking of thought at the moment of thought's emergence, the sound of one hand clapping. Inside the anechoic chamber at the University of Kansas, I noticed, at least as provocatively as the sound of coursing blood or the humming nervous system, the peculiar phenomenon unmentioned by Cage of trying to make a sound inside that space, for instance, to speak aloud, and finding that any word that was made stayed almost entirely confined inside the mouth, creating the eerie sensation of speaking from within one's own skull. The lips part, the throats contract, breath upon moist breath, but strangely the words remain stuck to the tongue. It's very strange. Like here, my voice is projecting, but in there it was just like right here. It never left my mouth. It would seem that with the loss of echo created with the chamber, any words spoken could not resonantly fully leave the mouth because of the absence of a sustaining atmosphere, the evacuated space lacking the necessary densities and textures upon which the words could pass and extend. Instead, when speaking, it was almost as if there were some kind of an invisible barrier covering the lips, preventing the language from leaving, the words sounding dulled or deadened. And with such thoughts at such sounds, suddenly Cage's space of non-silence had given way to something sounding a lot like another of my early and enduring influences, Samuel Beckett, and his evacuated stage, a bound enclosure and an echoing of empty words from within one's own hardened head. The silence of Beckett and Cage like two sides of the same coin. One of the other great pleasures of John Cage that I early on took very much to heart involved the creative empowerment of the individual, any individual, not just to open one's ears and to listen, but to apply one's energies and insights in creative works of one's own. Again, I don't know who's really deserves more credit or blame, John Cage or Marcel Duchamp, but even as a teenager still stumbling around Kansas, I felt such a liberating license, such open-ended encouragement from both of them to make work of my own. And his inspiration, this inspiration and energy has never really ceased, offering rich and daily pleasures in the creation of things, the making of art that was, thank God, thanks John and Marcel, no longer the private and protected domain of the well-trained artist, but was now open to all, even to me. One project that could only have happened had I spent so much of my life learning from, this was reference to the John Cage Festival in 2012, took place all over the city, and including on this very stage. It was quite an event. I'll talk more about it in a little bit. One project that could only have happened had I spent so much of my life learning from Cage involved a multi-year project of my own, one that began at UNF at its lovely library, an ongoing and eventually far-reaching project which came over the years to be called Writing on Art, Writing on Water, Writing on Air. And yes, there's a book outside. Please take one on your way out. I have a lot of them. So as a part of UNF's John Cage Festival celebrating Cage's centenary, and all week, all over the city event that I had and others had organized in 2012, this particular Writing on Water, Writing on Air installation, the fifth in a series of 20, was made up entirely of Cage's own words. On the pond, there was the large word silence, floating alone on the water, while on the library's windows overlooking that pond, one read, in motion while moving up the steps, the word there is between the first and second floor. Above that, no such thing. And at the top of the stairs, as silence. This line, there is no such thing as silence, already mentioned, is one of Cage's most well-known. And with this installation, there was presented something of Cage's evocatively mixed message, with the word silence written largely, loudly, on the water, while the words on the window, the sentence only fully read if moving to the library's top floor, imparting a conflicting message, one of denying silence, no such thing. One thing that was a pleasure were the superimpositions that were occurring between what was outside and what was inside, the silence as silence that was read on the water and then on the window simultaneously. In the library's entryway showcases on the library's ground floor, there was an accompanying display of 12 radio battery-operated radios arranged in a row with Cage's very large face seen just behind. All the radios were tuned to different stations, and entering the library, having just walked by the adjacent word silence on the water, you could faintly hear their transmissions mixing together of songs, of speaking, staticky signals and muffled voices broadcasting behind the glass. Over time, one by one, the batteries died on each of the radios, the showcases gradually going silent. Library workers, I was later told, working nearby and who listened to this all day long, were, I was told, none too thrilled by this constant confused sound coming from the cases, and were only too happy when all the batteries finally died. The final event, here's this. The final event of the installation, its final silencing, was when the word silence was unceremoniously pulled from the pond, dumped into the garbage, restoring the water to its uninscribed condition, back to its silent surface. By the way, once it was completed, I took pleasure in submitting a final notice to UNF's daily campus update that formally announced that the last stage of the installation, the pond uninscribed and empty, would remain in place indefinitely. And in fact, years later, it's still there. If you go, it's still there. The normally scrupulous editors apparently didn't catch the truth of the absurdity of the claim. Usually can't get anything by them, but this, I was quite proud of it. Oh, and my son, which you can see there, he's a little larger than that now. A small boy then, when at home one day, I asked him, exasperated while he was playing noisily, if he could please be quiet. He helped me with this project. He responded, but Dad, you know, there's no such thing as silence. And I was both proud and troubled by his quick response, kind of left speechless. I told him about this the other day, and he says, I never did that. I have no memory of that. And I remember it, and it's a good story, so I'm sticking with it. So of Cage's two, so there's the piece that's currently up. Yeah, and will remain. Yeah, of Cage's two settings for listening, or should I say for paying attention. The first, the anechoic chamber, the second, his silent composition, 433, and of the challenges, resistances, obstacles to hearing what's within them. The patience and practice called upon to simply sit still, to unmovingly listen. Both sides shared, as my son understood and exploited, a discovered awareness of silence's absence and the unintended emergence of indeterminate sound. As Cage noted, there is no such thing as an empty space or an empty time. There is always something to see, something to hear. In fact, try as we may to make silence, we cannot, Cage says. The white paintings are not white. The silent composition is not silent, and the empty pond is not empty. Just as silence had proved absent within the anechoic chamber, so was it absent from the 1952 premiere 433. For in the first movement of that piece, in Woodstock, New York, no less, that other much noisier concert was 1969 that we mostly know Woodstock for. There were, as Cage noted, the outside accidental sounds of stirring wind and then pattering raindrops. These sounds became then in the third movement, the living bodies of those restless in the room, the shifting and shuffling of impatience. Cage called these interesting sounds, he called them. And as Cage humorously, perhaps ironically, characterized them of people talking and walking out. He liked the sound of people walking out. Thank you all for staying. And there is yet another emboldening lesson from Cage to embrace the rejection. Even the noisy rebuff of people walking out on an event, as many did with Cage, always. And even perhaps hardest of all, the silence of being simply ignored, or worse, dismissed out of hand, and transforming the very sound of that rejection, that negation, into new, interesting material for music, a new substance for sound, people leaving, missing the point. I'm reminded of Rauschenberg's own response To those who he was told hadn't particularly liked one of his exhibitions, with him stating simply, and with that impish smile that he shared with his friend Cage, well, gosh, they just didn't get it. They just didn't get it. An attitude of whimsical dismissal of the dismissal that I've always found freeing and empowering. They just didn't get it. What's not to get? Honestly, what were you expecting? Right? As mentioned, you can see that in Stockholm, right? It's, yeah. As mentioned, in 2012 was the centenary of Cage's birth. And in addition to the UNF Event Festival and that spring's accompanying Writing on Water, Writing on Air installation, later that year, I completed another Cage-related project, this one a little far away, and it was in Paris, at the center of Paris's Galerie Colbert, and in conjunction with an international conference there on Cage, at which I was speaking, I installed a Writing on Air project. There was no water around, unfortunately. It was called In One Ear and Out the Other, using a number of his handwritten notations and performance directions, Cage's own handwritten score from his scores that I scanned, taken directly from Cage's musical scores. Of some of these directions, Cage said that the instructions were intended, quote, to get yourself in such a state of confusion that you think that a sound is not something to hear, but rather something to look at. So this was the Galerie Colbert. Wow, I wasn't in Kansas anymore. I knew that, the hallway. And then the installation took place in this atrium of the Galerie Colbert. 30 of these were then printed onto large transparencies, rolled up into a tube and transported across to the Galerie Colbert, where they were then taped to the 30 windows of that pretty sumptuous space. It was astonishing, staying up for the duration of that conference. So all of the language was again taken from scores and directions to performers. All right. Another of Cage's great gifts is how, in studying him, thinking about him, listening to him, you learn about so many others who moved within his orbit from, as already noted, so many different creative directions. There were painters, sculptors, philosophers, poets, dancers, musicians, mushroom hunters, and yes, of course, Zen Buddhists. And through them, learning of Buddhism, which I do believe should be partly accountable, even blamed, for Cage's rich and varied work. The exhibition upstairs is don't blame Zen. Yes, don't blame it on Zen. And of such prominent figures in Cage's life, there were, of course, his fellow composers, one of whom was his close friend, Morton Feldman. There are a great many stories about Cage and Feldman, and in a series of conversations between the two recorded for radio in 1966, Feldman talked about a recent visit of his to the beach. And Feldman said how annoying it was. He was encountering, he said, transistor radios blaring out rock and roll, he said, lamenting how what he called these, quote, intrusions on his life had prevented him from the peace and quiet that he had presumably sought there at the beach, or from the sounds that he may have hoped to hear. I don't know what, birds, waves, wind, silence, a space to think his own thoughts, who knows, whatever it was. Feldman felt as if, surrounded by such sounds of radios, he was being held captive by the annoying noises, obliged to surrender, he said, to them against his wishes or will. I'm reminded of the workers at the UNF library waiting for my radio batteries to die. Now, aside from the somewhat disturbing mental image of Morton Feldman in swimming trunks, bringing to mind a Philip Guston painting. Philip Guston did this portrait of Morton Feldman. There's the ironic fact that this conversation with Cage was recorded and perhaps heard later by some on transistor radios, maybe even at the beach, right? Maybe. And Feldman's frustration caused by hearing the unwelcome and uninterrupting noises of the radio caused Cage to interrogate further this experience of intrusion that his friend had just described. Characteristically, though, Cage gently counseled Feldman not to surrender, but to embrace such intrusions. And he said, quote, to listen to it with pleasure, attend to it, he said, pay attention and become interested in it. Cage then elaborated to Feldman upon how by changing one's way of thinking, one might come to enjoy such sounds as those heard at the beach or elsewhere, insisting, well, what it is that you are interested in is what superimposes what. What happens at the same time together with what happens before and what happens after. To Cage's suggestion that Feldman alter or enlarge his way of hearing, paying attention to the superimpositions of sound, what happens before and what happens after, there is the assertion that for Cage one might be able to listen for more than those sounds immediately present, for more than simply the sounds themselves, whatever that might mean, whatever that might entail. As Cage then explains to Feldman, offering the radio as a metaphorical device for the reception of such superimposed sound, all that radio is, Morty, he says to Feldman, is making available to your ears what was already in the air, to your ears, but you couldn't hear it. In other words, all it is making audible something which you are already in. You are bathed in radio waves, TV, broadcast, probably telepathic messages from other minds. And this radio simply makes audible something that you thought was inaudible. Cage presents here, there it is, a pretty radically new conception of listening in 1966. For this is a listening that, if achieved, would involve, in addition to a more immediate and positive listening, a negative listening as well, or even a kind of anti-hearing of non-perception superimposed upon perceptions. The sounds, as Cage here presents and redefines them, might then be heard to extend beyond the presence of sounds themselves, extending into an absence that is both before and after any actual event of sound. In time, out of time, such layerings of sound are both immediate and immediately mediated. And of Cage's proposal for a more expansive form of superimposed listening, Feldman replied, clearly troubled by the very thought of what Cage was proposing, and in as close to a personal rebuke of Cage as Feldman would ever come. He said that at the time, I mean, just simply stated, this is Feldman, I can't conceive of some brat turning on a transistor radio in my face and my saying, the environment. Feldman went on to even more delicately counter or question Cage, slyly insinuating, perhaps, that Cage shared some characteristics with such a brat at the beach. It's kind of true. With the suggestion that even if he were to try and listen for such superimpositions of sound, Feldman wrote, I can't think unless thought is something of the past. Here, Feldman forthrightly acknowledges that what he perceives as thought's inevitable enabling precedence to the very thinking of thought, where to think at all is to think of the past. In Cage's affirmation of sound superimpositions, though, he wasn't here asking Feldman simply or merely to think about the sounds of the radio heard at the beach. Cage instead was indicating that it was perhaps thinking, or a certain kind of deep thinking that had been spoken of earlier, that the two men had just discussed, the image of it, the self-image of it, of that kind of thought, that was part of the problem. For it was this kind of self-reflexive thought, Cage believed, that was largely responsible for creating the staticky interference to a more temporally dispersed form of hearing, affirming instead less depth of thought, perhaps, and more breadth of it. Such an expansive kind of hearing is thus corporeally as well as cerebrally engaged, a thinking and listening in time through the body. Cage later described such a superimposed mode of listening in motion, hearing in time in the following manner. I guess in my case that it goes out of thought into experience, and that we can be, not just with our minds, but with our whole being, responsive to sound. And that sound doesn't have to be the communication of some deep thought. They can just be sound. Now that sound could go in one ear and out the other, or it could go in one ear, permeate the being, transform the being, and then perhaps go out, letting the next one in. And they both laugh uproariously on the radio. And then whether an idea developed, the hardest thing in the world, of course, is to have a head without any ideas in it. To this affirmation of absence and to what is, as Cage characterized it, the hardest thing in the world, Feldman appears to concede the point to the value of the empty head, the empty mind, responding, but that's always the best work, And it is in large part thanks to Cage that the windows of concert halls, the windows onto the world, to a life intently and responsibly lived, these windows, there aren't any, these windows are now more widely open for us all. As a result, there's no telling what might finally be heard from them. As Cage once noted, quote, the composer resembles the maker of a camera who allows someone else to take the picture. While as such a composer, perhaps Cage's most important compositional act, as well as the most enduring and valuable part of his rich legacy, are his expansive and liberating lessons in listening. And the fact that he certainly never told us what we were and were not to listen to, internally, externally, backwards, forwards, inside and out, as all sounds are now equally available, those heard, and perhaps even more delicately, those that remain unheard, absent, there at the center of the ear. Just keep listening, stay still, seeing into the silence. Feldman, in a follow-up radio conversation with Cage, movingly stated that, this is Feldman saying, I know that when I write a piece of music, sometimes I'm telling people, we're not going to be here very long. Of Feldman's poignant and elegiac claim for his music, one might imagine Cage nonetheless affirmatively responding that such a life, however long, if lived attentively, would be long enough, offering each of us just the right amount of time to hear superimposed what's there to be heard and not heard, see what's there to be seen and not seen, and in the process to be awakened, as Cage described elsewhere, quote unquote, to the very life that we're living, the very life that we're living. So I began by talking about those early photographs of Cage that inspired me, always showing such a joyous guy, happily laughing, having so much fun. I wanted to have that kind of fun. Evidence of what he called his sunny disposition. And so it seems fitting to end, after having begun with the silence of 433, with the sound of that laughter. In listening to those recorded conversations between Cage and Feldman, one can't help but notice the fun that these two men are having in talking, the very sound of their friendship and the frequent laughter that comes with their conversations. And of that laughter, a while back, I created this sound piece called Cage Feldman Laugh. I came up with a better title today. Never mind, I can't remember what it is. First presented at a Cage conference in Paris, this piece, taken from those recorded conversations between Cage and Feldman between July 1966 and January of 67, and broadcast over the radio on the beach, maybe, who knows. Over the couple of hours of recording, I isolated and extracted every moment where Cage and Feldman began laughing, which was a lot. This piece is, by the way, 4 minutes and 33 seconds. So.
We can do that without drinking. It's also better, much better. Which simply, you know what? We can do that without drinking. And I had then with simply, you know what?
Okay. I forgot to acknowledge that in the background, you were hearing a piece from Cage's great piece, the Pianos and Sonatas for Prepared Piano. That was the background of what was playing on the piano. A really monumental piece that I could also have easily spoken about. Anyway, that's it for tonight. Thank you for coming. But if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to try and respond to them. Anybody at all? Yeah.
Is there anywhere that we can read the paper you read tonight?
Sure. I'll send it to you. Yeah. And I have a couple of other Cage publications. Some of it was taken over from this, but most of this was new. Yeah. 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 Anybody else? Any questions? All right. Thank you for coming. Thank you, the UNF folks. This is a phenomenal way to open.